Why have African people been viewed as a threat across different eras of history? This is a profound question that reaches into the very roots of world events, yet it's rarely explored with the depth it deserves. Let me clarify something. This video is not meant to create conflict or diminish the value of any race. My purpose isn't to divide, but to confront the uneasy truths of the past and analyze why Africans and their descendants were often seen this way. This represents my personal perspective. No one can fully grasp the mindset of those who shape these ideas, but I want to point out recurring patterns, raise difficult questions, and show how these old perceptions still affect the lives of people of African descent today. This isn't a call for pity or recognition. It's about understanding how history has carved the reality we live in now. So, lean in, because this is African Myths Unveiled. Before we continue, let me ask you something. I know many of you are watching from all over the globe, drawn together by a fascination with African myths. So, let's reconnect. Tell me in the comments where you're joining from. I'll be there, responding and engaging with you. And if this content speaks to you, hitting the like button and subscribing would mean so much. Now, let's jump back into the story. People often say that truth carries immense power, and for some, that power is frightening. From the dawn of history, Africa was never just another continent. It was the origin, the birthplace, the ground where humanity first emerged. But fear rises when the world realizes that those it tried to diminish are in fact its foundation. This is where the unease begins. Long before the arrival of ships, chains, and distorted history books, Africa was recognized not only as a land but as a guiding light. The Nubians, the Kushites, the Cometians, builders of empires, guardians of time, pioneers of science, medicine, and astronomy. Their wisdom was no fable. It was etched into stone, measured through monuments that still rise against centuries of erosion and denial. And that reality shook the world. Because if the earliest humans were black, if the first civilizations were African, if mathematics, healing, and philosophy were born beneath Africa's sun, then history must face an undeniable truth. To position Africa at the heart of history is to rewrite the entire story of superiority. It shows that those celebrated as discoverers were in fact centuries late. It reveals that people dismissed as primitive were actually the trailblazers. And this shifts the balance of power. The concept that blackness isn't on the outskirts of history, but at its very foundation threatens a world built on hierarchy. If humanity's roots are African, if the beginning is black, then controlling Africa was never just about land or labor, it was about seizing the truth itself. Even outsiders of the ancient world knew this. Herodotus, often called the father of history, wrote of Ethiopians as tall, wise, and strong, excelling in sciences beyond the Greeks. Arab explorers marveled at the riches and order of African kingdoms. Chinese voyagers described advanced societies built on art, spirituality, and law. But admiration soon turned to fear. The more the world witnessed, the more it trembled at what Africa embodied, a power not born in the West, and a legacy that could only be erased through force. And so, the story was rewritten. Africans were recast as savages, even while holding the blueprint of civilization itself. Their gods were dismissed as idols, their traditions reduced to superstition, their accomplishments hidden away, sometimes buried beneath museums, sometimes swallowed by foreign flags. Because admitting Africa's central role would also mean admitting a global debt. And that acknowledgement has always been treated as dangerous. Let's be clear, this isn't only about the past. It's about why African presence continues to unsettle systems never designed for us, but built on top of us. It's about why erasing African brilliance wasn't random, it was deliberate. The opening chapter of this story is not one of weakness or defeat. It is one of origin. An origin that is unbroken, unyielding, and profoundly powerful. And for centuries, the world has sought to silence a power that never waited for permission. There's a reason the black body has been both dreaded and romanticized, respected yet dominated, celebrated yet enslaved. From the sugar plantations of the Caribbean to the cotton fields of the American South, the African body wasn't just a labor force, it was perceived as a threat, alive with strength, rhythm, and endurance. Let's examine how physicality became a political weapon. Colonizers often described Africans with contradictory labels: strong yet simple, resilient yet thoughtless, powerful yet controllable. These weren't mere observations, they were tools of propaganda. Claims like built for toil, less sensitive to pain, able to endure suffering were carefully crafted lies, designed to dehumanize while instilling fear of what Africans could achieve if liberated. Because, plainly put, it wasn't weakness they feared. What terrified the world was the idea of African strength combined with self-determination. Consider the historical use of sports, music, and military service. Black athletes excel on global stages, yet suspicion often overshadows their achievements. Black soldiers fought in wars for nations that denied them basic rights. Black musicians created some of the world's most influential genres, only to have their work stolen, diluted, or appropriated. Even in moments of success, African descendants often face discomforting scrutiny. Why? Because uncontrolled excellence threatens systems built on dominance. This fear of the black body is centuries old. Ancient Roman records described Nubian warriors as formidable. Arab historians admired the stamina and resilience of East African traders. European slave traders, despite dehumanizing Africans, meticulously documented their strength, endurance, and survival against brutal conditions that would crush most men. Over time, this fear grew into a deeper, more insidious force. The myth of the superhuman African persists, the same idea that suggests black people are naturally gifted in sports. But behind that so-called praise lies a darker reality. It oversimplifies, denies intellectual depth, dismisses emotions, and enforces control. This is why black men are often perceived as threats simply walking through certain spaces. It's why black women's bodies are policed, sexualized, and simultaneously labeled as too resilient to need care. Across the globe, the African body has long been a contested battlefield, both physically and symbolically, because a strong people aware of their own power become unstoppable. For centuries, systems were built to keep African strength reactive rather than revolutionary. But that is shifting. From the diaspora to the continent, we are reclaiming the story, not only of our history, but of our existence today. The body is more than flesh, it is cultural, spiritual, and political. And when you grasp this, you see why the African body has never been merely powerful. It is power itself. And power without control is what empires fear above all else. When we think of oppression, images of chains, whips, or guns often come to mind. Yet some of the most damaging weapons used against African people were not physical, they were intellectual. Erasure, revision, and rebranding became tools of control. Let's explore how African knowledge itself became a battlefield, and why remembering it is an act of resistance. Long before European colonizers set sail, Africa thrived as a hub of science, architecture, philosophy, astronomy, and medicine. From the mathematical marvels of Great Zimbabwe to the Dune people's celestial understanding of Sirius B, a star Western astronomers only documented in the 20th century, African civilizations were unraveling the universe long before colonizers had even charted it. And yet, in many modern classrooms, Africa's story begins with slavery. Why? Because knowledge is power. African knowledge directly threatened colonial power. It exposed the lie that Africa was uncivilized and debunked the myth that black people had no history before slavery. In response, libraries were burned, scholars were silenced, languages banned, and spiritual systems criminalized. Pioneering figures like Imhotep, a polymath who lived over 1,000 years before Hippocrates and is the true father of medicine, were erased from memory. Timbuktu, home to more than 700,000 manuscripts on medicine, mathematics, law, and theology in Arabic, Ajami, and African scripts, was minimized and forgotten. Ancient Kemet, known as Egypt, was buried under the misconception of being a European wonder, when in reality it was a black civilization that shaped the world. Why go to such lengths? Because acknowledging African intellectual mastery would topple the very foundation of white supremacy. One cannot claim superiority over a people whose ancestors invented surgery, algebra, metallurgy, irrigation, and cosmology. While others struggled to survive winters in rudimentary huts, Africans carried a culture that made them impossible to enslave. A worldview that connected land, spirit, body, and time, and treated life as sacred rather than a commodity, could not be conquered. You cannot dominate a people who know their origins. So, enslaved Africans were forbidden from learning to read. Textbooks were rewritten. African spirituality was labeled witchcraft, and African science dismissed as superstition. The narratives of our people were told by outsiders, for outsiders. Yet the stories endured, encoded in songs, symbols, and oral traditions whispered across generations. Our knowledge was never lost, it was concealed. And now it is resurfacing, in the revival of African-centered education, in the global embrace of ancestral practices and herbal medicine, and in the scholars, artists, and visionaries of the diaspora reclaiming truth. Understanding the brilliance embedded in African legacy reveals why it was silenced, and, more importantly, what unfolds when that silence is broken. Fear has trailed African people wherever colonial powers set foot, not because they were fragile, but because they refused to remain broken. Across continents and centuries, African resistance has struck terror into empires, for every attempt to crush the African spirit only made it rise louder, stronger, and unyielding. Let's explore the historical fear of African rebellion and why it runs so deep. While names like Nat Turner, Yaa Asantewaa, and Toussaint Louverture are remembered, few grasp how widespread and persistent African resistance truly was. On slave ships, captives leapt into the sea rather than submit. Across the Americas, revolts erupted from Brazil's shores to Haiti's plantations. On the continent, fortresses were built, secret codes devised, warriors trained, and kingdoms defended with military strategies that rivaled any empire. The Zulu nation, under Shaka Zulu, revolutionized warfare across southern Africa. The Kingdom of Dahomey boasted an elite all-female military corps, the Agoji, whose prowess terrified invading forces. In Jamaica and Suriname, Maroon communities fled into mountains and jungles, creating autonomous territories that colonial armies could never fully dominate. But here's the overlooked truth: African resistance was not solely fought with weapons. It thrived through spiritual defiance, cultural preservation, and intellectual rebellion. Messages were hidden in drumbeats. Christian hymns were transformed into songs of liberation. Escape routes were braided into children's hair. Deities were concealed within Catholic saints, turning slavery into a battleground of faith. This resilience rendered African people unpredictable to oppressors. How do you enslave those who feel the presence of their ancestors guiding them? How do you dominate a people who draw meaning from struggle and strength from memory? Bodies may be beaten, homes burned, but souls and dreams cannot be silenced. This struck terror into the hearts of colonizers. At its foundation, white supremacy relies on submission, and African resistance revealed a threat to that order. One can be bound and still remain free. That same spirit persists today, challenging the status quo. From the streets of Ferguson to the protests in Lagos, from Johannesburg to Baltimore, a rhythm, a fire, a force persists that refuses to be extinguished. The unspoken fear within many institutions is that this energy, the collective awakening, will inspire others to resist, question, and rise. That is why African resistance has often been labeled dangerous, radical, or violent, because it communicates a truth that unsettles the powerful. Freedom is never given, it is claimed, and African people across the diaspora have always understood how to claim it. As we conclude this journey, we must ask, why does African identity still feel threatening in the 21st century? The colonial powers may have departed, but the structures they established linger, built on exploitation, erasure, and fear. In today's interconnected world, Africa remains a formidable force, not merely because of its natural resources, but due to the immense, untapped potential of its people, cultures, and revolutionary spirit. African identity transcends geography. It is a collective power that challenges entrenched global systems. It is a force that resists categorization, commodification, or containment. A force rooted in its history, aware of its origins, and conscious of its future. Let's examine why this unstoppable energy continues to unsettle established powers, beginning with Africa's enduring economic and cultural significance. Although Africa boasts the world's youngest population, abundant natural resources, and rapidly expanding economies, many nations on the continent continue to be treated as exploited territories by global powers. Whether it's multinational corporations extracting oil in Nigeria, mining diamonds in Sierra Leone, or looting African art and cultural artifacts, control over Africa's wealth still shapes global politics. Yet a new Africa is emerging, resisting in ways never seen before. From Afrobeats dominating the international music scene to Pan-African movements challenging Western educational narratives, African culture is asserting itself as a symbol of modern power. The diaspora is redefining what it means to be African, and the world is paying attention. African fashion, literature, film, and technology are no longer niche. They are at the forefront of global influence. This is why Africa's authentic identity remains a challenge to global systems. It embodies resilience, freedom, and self-determination, defying Western ideals of conformity, uniformity, and control. As African people increasingly embrace their culture, donning traditional attire with pride, speaking indigenous languages, and practicing ancestral spiritual traditions, they reveal a power that cannot be confined by borders or external expectations. This freedom of identity unsettles those who seek to dominate, threatening the foundations of a global system built on inequality. The influence of the black dollar is now becoming visible. The achievements of African entrepreneurs, content creators, and scholars continue to grow, forcing the world to reconsider its perception of Africa. As nations reclaim their voice, land, and wealth on their own terms, global powers must acknowledge the force of African identity. The reality is that as African identity flourishes, it disrupts centuries-old narratives of dominance and subjugation. From street activism to economic influence, the African identity once feared as a threat now rises, not to overpower others, but to assert its rightful place in shaping the global conversation. African identity embraces, rather than rejects, and it is a force that cannot be erased. Throughout this video, we've examined how historical perceptions of Africans as a threat are rooted in complex patterns of power, fear, and resistance. From Africa's role as the cradle of humanity to the profound impact of its civilizations, and the enduring strength of African identities, these perceptions have influenced the world we inhabit today. Yet the reality is clear: Africa's story is not one of victimhood. It is a narrative of resilience, survival, and an unbreakable bond to the land, its people, and the future. The fear of Africans was never about weakness, it was about the threat of their power, a power that continues to resonate. The world cannot erase Africa's legacy. As Africans reclaim their space in global narratives, we demonstrate that the continent's wisdom, beauty, and strength remain an unstoppable force. This is not merely history, it is a living legacy, actively shaping both our present and our future.